This is made by Eimer Engineering. They're out of Southern California. They do make these bolt-in cages for the Honda Civic platform, and I think they do a couple other platforms as well. But this is the lightweight roll bar. It weighs about 50 pounds. I measured it on the scale. I did opt for the powder coating, so I got it powder coated black. It is a sort of a semi-gloss black. They let you pick your color from a catalog. That was an extra 150 bucks, but in my opinion, well worth it. Roll cage itself was about 800, kind of on the low end for a bolt-in roll cage for a chassis like this. All in all, shipped, I think I was in it for about right around $1,000, I think. It took about a month to get to me as far as lead time. So this is the install procedure. One thing I will say is they do not have installation instructions. Contrary to what their website says, the roll bar did not come with any instructions. So I actually reached out to them after the fact and asked if they had any printed instructions or installation videos or anything like that. And they don't. They pointed me in the direction of a customer who had made a really short Instagram video. It wasn't real thorough. It was a fine video for Instagram, but I figured I would make one in long format, showing you how I installed the roll bar. Without further ado, let's go. The trusty PLM X brace is going to have to go, unfortunately. I did like this brace. You could really tell it stiffened up the chassis in the rear, and so hopefully we won't lose too much stiffness. The new cage bolts into the shock towers as well, so there won't be enough space for both of these things. Okay, so we've got it mocked up here. I've got the main hoop in, just sitting on the floor of the car here. And what I did to get this centered was just take a tape measure and measure the distance between the sidewall of the car and the first hole in the base of the main hoop. So it was about 2 3/4 of an inch on both sides. I've just got that centered so that it's equal. And then I've got this basically pushed up all the way against the back of this rear footwell here. It doesn't line up perfectly. There's a little bit of side to side gap is what I mean. Over here it's the same though, which is fine. These bars will bend a little bit. Right now, the back supports on both sides are lining up pretty nicely with the main hoop brackets where they're going to bolt in together up at the top here. The front part of this bracket here is sitting down on the top of the shock tower, but the rear of it, you can see, is not quite sitting flush. And if I were to close that gap, let me show you what happens. There is where there's no gap. I'll just cinch this nut down here. So that's all flush now, like it's going to be when it's tightened. If we go back up to where the main hoop meets the bar, you can see that there's a huge gap between where these things are going to mate up. Those are going to have to get kind of cinched together with the bolts, but I'm only going to be able to do that after I've secured the bottom, because otherwise it's going to lift the whole main hoop up off the floor. Yeah, you can see on this side too, just a huge gap. In order to close that gap with no tension, you'd have to raise the main hoop a good inch or so off the floor. I'm not sure why it's like that. It's going to create a little bit of tension constantly between the rear bar and the main hoop. I don't know if that's by design or if that's just kind of a difference in chassis between their the chassis that they designed this bar on and mine. So it's not completely custom. You're going to have stuff like this with a bolt-in. There's a workaround. It's not going to be that difficult to deal with. In order to not have a twisting force like this on my shock studs, on my coilover studs here. What I'm going to do is probably put a nice thick washer underneath between this bracket and the shock tower. A tiny amount of space here is going to translate into a lot of movement at the end of that arm. But first things first, let's get the main hoop bolted in. We'll make sure it's centered again. Put 4 bolts in each side with the plates underneath. We'll just kind of bolt it in loosely at first. Then we'll connect these points up here. We'll get the back bolts in. We'll get everything connected with the hardware in, and then we'll start tightening them up in sequence. All right, so this is what we're working with here. We have the 2 base plates. Those will go under the main hoop plates on the underside of the car. The floor on these cars is super, super thin. I think it's like 1/8 of an inch thick, if that. So these 8 bolts here, these are grade 5 bolts. They came with the plates. This all came with the roll bar as the hardware package. These 4 Allen bolts and lock nuts are for connecting the two halves of the cage together. Everything seems to be good quality. These bolts are stainless, obviously, by the color. I don't think these are stainless, which is, kind of unfortunate because these are going to be the ones that are going to be under the car, exposed to the elements. All right, so we're over here on the passenger side. Just going to double measure real quick. So yeah, 2.75 inches to the center of this hole here. It's within 1/8 of an inch on either side. Close enough. Main hoop is in the right spot, side to side. I'm just going to cinch it up a little bit towards the back wall here. It's just right up against the back wall. So now I'm going to go ahead and mark with a Sharpie where I'm going to drill these holes. I'm using the neck of the Sharpie here on the inside of the hole to make my circle. You wouldn't think maybe it's not that important, but it actually is pretty important how you mark the hole. If you've got your Sharpie angled one way or another, your marking could be offset from the hole. And you want to get this right because the tolerances are pretty small. So these are 3/8 inch holes in the base plate and then also in the plate that goes underneath. So I'm using a 3/8 inch drill bit. So it needs to be exactly on. The only way that I could make adjustments if I do it wrong is to make the hole in the floor bigger, the 4 holes in the floor. So I don't want to do that. I want those holes to be as small as possible so that we can prevent tear out. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side without moving the hoop. All right, so we're over here on the driver's side now. Hoop is pushed up against the back wall there. Just maybe a little bit off the wall, like a 1/16 of an inch or so. All right, that's where it's going to sit. Another way to do this would be to drill with the hoop sitting where it is. I don't really want to do that because that would require ruining the powder coating in the middle of the holes. Water will inevitably seep up from underneath along the bolts, and that's just a prime place for that to start rusting out in the future. So that's ready to go. Now I'm going to take the main hoop out. We are going to drill. I'm going to use a center punch. Always a good idea to do that when you're drilling metal so that your drill bit doesn't walk, especially when you get to a spot like this. I don't know if you can tell, but this hole is going to be right on the edge of this ridge, the corrugation in the floor. Definitely use a center punch on these holes. This thing works awesome. It just reams the hole out nicely. Sometimes helps widen out your holes just a tad bit if you under drill. All right, not bad. We're over here in the driver's side footwell, so we're just going to do the same procedure. Yeah, not bad. Alrighty. So let's see if we can get this diagonal one in here. There we go. Oh, it lines up so well that it falls out. Gotta love it. So I'm just gonna make sure that I can run these other 2 bolts up through here. All right, so all 4 on the passenger side will go through. All right, we are on the driver's side. Moment of truth here. Grab this plate, stick our first one through. Just gonna leave these hand tight. This hoop, even though it's bolted in, it's still able to angle back and forth just because that floor is so thin. Ideally, I'd want to put get some floor plates welded in, some thick pieces of steel. You can still see that there's a pretty sizable gap here. I'm just going to kind of squeeze them together. Put that in like that. This nut will kind of sit in this little hole here. So we'll just leave that while we get the other side in. Once you get one diagonal support in, you realize how strong the whole system becomes. I keep looking for the nut. I need to remember that I've already put it up there in the cradle. Don't lose your nuts. So the 4 bolts holding the 2 pieces together are torqued. Man, this thing is solid now that those are together. And I haven't even tightened the base bolts of the hoop or on the rear shock towers yet, so we'll do that next. The front part of this bracket seems to sit down on the shock tower. There's no gap under here, but this back one does have a gap. So I'm gonna see if I can get a nice thick washer in here. See, that even won't be thick enough. We'll slip under here. Yeah, that takes up the gap pretty well. So I was able to lift this off. I haven't loosened up any of the bolts here. So I'm gonna drop 1 and 2 on there like that. I'm gonna do the same on the other side. All right, so I got all those on. Now I'm just gonna kind of cinch this back over. Thread my nuts on here. So you can see how it's sitting on the washers there on this back part. And on the front, it's sitting on the shock tower there. So we'll leave it that way for now. If they want that sitting all the way down on the top of the shock tower, I suppose that'd be ideal, but it would flex the thin metal top of the shock tower. All right, we got the washers here. They have a rounded side and a sharp side. You can kind of see that the edges are sharper on this side. I'll always put the rounded side towards the painted surface. So in this case, the rounded side will go down. That way, if the washer does spin, that sharp edge isn't cutting into the powder coating. All right, passenger side. You can see where the main hoop goes down there. Comes through. We've got our reinforcement plate there. It's not the thickest plate in the world. You can see it's bending a little bit. You can see the light sort of warping off of it. It has bent a bit to accommodate the floor of the car, which, as you can see, is corrugated here. It's not perfectly flat, so All right, well, that's a wrap for the roll cage install. It took a little bit longer than expected, but what doesn't, when it comes to cars? I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. It looks badass. I think it'll be quite functional too. And I'm just happy to have a little bit more rigidity and stiffness in the car. And yeah, so that's it. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you watching. Hit that like button. Would appreciate it. And if you want to see more stuff like this, hit that subscribe button. Appreciate it. Later.